Well, I'm delighted to welcome my next guest back to Property Tribes TV. It's Bill Irvine, and I regard him as the foremost authority on LHA and universal credit in the UK. And Bill and I spoke in May, actually on the 9th of May, just as the kind of fallout from the COVID-19 lockdown started to become apparent. And Bill, I don't know about you, but it's only kind of 6 months ago, but it feels like almost another lifetime that so much has happened in the interim.
Yeah, it's been quite incredible the last, since May, it's been quite incredible what's actually been happening. If I go back to February, March, when we started the lockdown, I started to get out walks with my wife first thing in the morning, and we're now, 9 months down the line, and we're still out there walking every day. The things that have happened from a benefits point of view with DWP is also quite incredible. The way in which they've had to transform their business over the last 6 or 7 months in particular, especially with the move away from an office-based delivery to a remote delivery, because most of the DWP staff were actually asked to work from home, and they had to be linked up to laptops and telephony and all the other things to try and make this thing work. So to that extent, it's been quite remarkable. The amount of interest as well from landlords and letting agents as well has been quite incredible, particularly over the last 3 or 4 months. I'm doing these Zoom sessions, which I'd never done before COVID. I've been doing these Zoom sessions as an alternative to the courses I would normally do for the NRLA and others. And, we're doing sometimes 2 and 3 days a week just to have conversations with landlords and letting agents, particularly those that I've never dealt with, I've never had in the past, tenants that were claiming housing benefit or universal credit. For them, this is all new, and they're all desperate to find out how they can help their tenants. And that's partly due as well to what's been happening with the courts. As you know, sometimes referred to as the ban on evictions, which really is not. It's more about delaying the process in many cases, but they've also introduced this pre-action requirements we spoke about the last time, where landlords are now having to engage with their tenants much more than they were in the past, so that they can work out some kind of repayment system that would hopefully allow them to get rent, or at least part of their rent, and at the same time protect the tenancy.
Absolutely, and I should mention that for our last interview back in May, we did receive a tweet from Neil Cooling, the Director General of the DWP, complimenting us on the information that we'd shared in that interview, which I know we were both very, very delighted that he had watched it and commented. And when we last spoke in May, Bill, we were just talking about the rollout of furlough and all the government measures, the increased LHA allowance announced by the Chancellor, which surely helped a lot of people over the crisis point. But as we speak now in October, we're actually reaching the end of furlough, and that's going to introduce a whole different raft of issues, isn't it?
Yeah, there's no doubts about that. There's the economy, we've yet to see what's going to happen, how bad it's going to be, but it's anticipated that there could be somewhere between 2 to 4 million new claims for universal credit submitted as a direct result of furlough being effectively, well, it's not been effectively withdrawn, but it's certainly going to be a different scheme to the furlough scheme, because the people who will qualify for it will qualify for considerably less than they were before. There's an expected contribution from the DWP, from the employer, the DWP or the government, and also the tenant in some cases picking up some of that responsibility as well, particularly those that are maybe working part-time. And there's quite a complicated formula as well for that. But there's still going to be many people who are going to have to rely on universal credit as their lifeline. They won't be able to maybe access some of these payments, because they're effectively their work, which was probably healthy and financially viable, has become not so directly because of the COVID crisis. So some of these people are going to be made redundant. Some are going to have their hours slashed to a level where they're going to have to apply for help with their housing costs in some cases, and it will be universal credit that will actually apply for. There's also going to be a different cohort. There's going to be a lot of people they anticipate who will fall into the 16 to 25 category, and there'll also be other people in the 60 plus category that will be disproportionately affected by this. So again, these will probably result in many people actually applying for universal credit.
Yes, and there'll be some people that regard themselves as vulnerable and won't want to go back into a work situation as well. So lots of different people affected in different ways, by the COVID-19 crisis. And I think one thing that we touched on in the last interview was the rapid response of the DWP, because obviously they had to adapt to working from home and set up all their systems remotely, etc. And I can only imagine that they are working absolutely flat out. Are you noticing or hearing of any delays in new claims that are being made for UC or LHA?
No, I mean, I'm not hearing very much by way of delays. I think much of the backlog that was there was actually cleared. DWP were, in fact, from July, starting to get back to some kind of semblance of normality, but their staff were still working from home a lot of the time, but some of them had started to go back to the office for a few days a week. Practice managers were back in the office. So the liaison contacts that landlords had with them were re-established there for a wee while. But again, because of the latest restrictions, a lot of those things that had started to change are now being reversed. And a lot of them are actually going back to working from home, and some of the other things like the actual claims themselves. When somebody makes a claim, they normally have to make a claimant commitment, and that would normally involve a face-to-face interview. So they started to introduce half-hour interviews over the phone, but only for new claims, and that's likely to what's going to happen over the next few weeks and months ahead. They'll continue to do that type of thing, whereas I think they were anticipating at some point they would return to the days where they would be able to sit in front of the individual and actually talk them through the different responsibilities they have. So a lot of those things will probably continue. So people they'll be making a claim online, they'll be making a claimant commitment probably over a telephone conversation. They'll be validating their various incomes, if they have any, as well, by the DWP working at arm's length. And it makes it all the more difficult. If you're able-bodied, if you're somebody who's au fait with IT, comfortable with it, then it's not so much of a problem. But if you're somebody who's new, has never done this before, and even people who are professionals sometimes haven't a clue when it comes to this, and so they're asking. My phone is ringing all the time, particularly from landlords, saying, "Look, I've got somebody who's getting made redundant, Bill. What advice should we give?" And it's difficult sometimes to actually give proper advice without first of all establishing what all the facts are, because it can be quite a complicated situation. For example, if you think back to what happened in March, the lockdown was, I think, around about the 23rd, and a lot of people actually made their application straight away for universal credit. But many of them actually received a wage on the 30th or the 31st of March, and because they had made their claim on the 23rd, those wages were taken into account and effectively wiped out any potential entitlement they had. Whereas if they had waited until the 1st of April and made their claim, the wages they had had on the 30th or the 31st would have been ignored. So some of them actually lost out. In fact, Neil Cowling actually highlighted that, and I sent one of my bulletins out basically saying, you really need to think about this, and if you've got people locally that can give you that advice, go and see them. There's welfare rights workers, there's money advice workers, there's law centres that sometimes provide that type of advice. Housing associations also provide advice in-house for a lot of their tenants. So if you can tap into that, get that advice before you make to make before you make the decision whether you make your claim today or whether you wait a week or a fortnight before doing so.
Absolutely. So we are expecting a second spike of claimants when furlough officially ends on the 31st of October. So what tips can you give to landlords from recent experiences around tenants, redundancies and reductions in working hours, etc.?
What I would say is that if they qualify for the job support scheme, the likelihood is that that will be more generous than universal credit. Apart from maybe in areas like London where the housing costs are so high. But for those that are in any doubt at all, there is nothing wrong with actually putting in a claim for universal credit, assuming that they don't have any wages, they don't have any final settlement to receive, they maybe haven't been working for long enough. In those cases, if you're in any doubt whatsoever and you can't get that advice locally, then you should put in your claim. But ideally, try and find out if there is citizen advice will tell you whether there are organisations locally that can provide that help, because sometimes it has to be bespoke. In terms of actually making the claim itself, the claim is actually relatively straightforward, and I've created links on the NRLA website in the past and explaining to landlords and letting agents how they could advise their tenants. People can also access some of the bulletins on my website, and that gives you advice. DWP also have their own website, the www.gov.uk site, and there's a link if you just / universal credit. It takes you through to a lot of information, and they've got some videos as well about how to actually claim universal credit. The claim is made online, but there's also some validation needs to be done, and that's usually by DWP staff creating a link and asking you to provide, for example, details of the tenancy agreement. Landlords sometimes ask me, well, can we actually provide information? And there's nothing to stop a landlord from actually providing information like the tenancy agreement or validating how much the tenant the rent is for the property. DWP are sometimes reluctant to accept that, which is surprising because the regulations expect the landlord to provide that information if asked for. And when somebody who's a landlord is receiving money paid directly to them, they've actually got an obligation to advise DWP of any changes. For example, like the rent increase in April when the LHA went up. A landlord should be able to email the DWP and say to them, look, my tenant, Mr. Bill Irvine, or whatever address, his rent has went up, and they can provide that information. The NRLA have also got their advice line, and it's an exceptionally good resource. I don't know how much the charge is, but it's less than £100 per year. And the people who answer that also have the best, at least a basic understanding of the universal credit scheme and how to access. And if you're a member of that, they will actually create links as well for you to look at. There's also the websites, like your own Property Tribes. The website, the one I mentioned, the government website, where if you get into them, there's loads of information there. If you take a few minutes of your time, you'll be able to find information that will help you determine whether you should make a claim or not.
Yes, and we will put the link to the Government Universal Credit website underneath this video. And also, Property Tribes is a partner of the NRLA, and our members can enjoy a 15% discount off membership to access that helpline, which runs from 9 to 5 every day. And I call it phone a friend for landlords. And that would be the same for Bill with your subscribers, that you have a phone advice service as well, don't you?
Yeah, I as well as having the website, Universal Credit Advice, I send out regular bulletins to landlords and letting agents that are members. And it's just giving them an update of what's actually happening, if there's any rule changes, guidance changes, or there's case studies that I create, which are designed basically to help people's understanding of what the issues are. And there's loads of examples like that. One of the main concerns of landlords is, how can we get our hands on the payment of universal credit, the housing costs? And that, you asked me earlier on about, any problems. That is an area that is still causing problems. DWP created this new website and we all welcomed it. because what it did basically was it created a new online ability to make the claim to get the benefit redirected to the landlord, especially where a tenant had actually received the money and misused the money, or had run up 2 months arrears or 1 month's arrears over a longer period, 2 or 3 months. They were entitled to actually receive the money paid direct. And the new online system in some ways is much better than the UC47s that people keep on phoning me about, which were made redundant effectively 3 or 4 months ago. But when things go well, it's great. But when things go wrong, that's when the problems is, because communicating with DWP, I think partly because of COVID, that is the biggest obstacle. Landlords complain quite rightly. There is no dedicated telephone number for them to phone, or if the one that was there, you have to wait for half an hour to get through to it, or 40 minutes sometimes. I mean, you get through, the person on the other end of the phone refuses to speak to you because you don't have the explicit consent of the tenant in some cases. In some cases, the tenant has already given consent by using their online journal. And even there, the DWP sometimes refused actually to share information using the Data Protection Act and GDPR as the reasons for refusing. I pick up a lot of these complaints. And the best way to deal with DWP is to send an email. And in the last conversation we had, I think we created a link to the practice managers or the district managers for the area, and I'll give you a link today, and you can include that as well. If you contact the practice manager once you've made your application and say, look, I submitted my claim 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, or whatever, and I'm concerned that my tenant will get the money and misuse it again, then these practice managers will then forward that to the case manager, the person who deals with your tenant's case, and they will then investigate that. That's the most effective way. People keep telling me about how long it's taking them to get through on the phone and how it doesn't work. The best way of doing it, the way I do it, the way my daughter does it, who does this, she manages a portfolio of 180 houses, and she does everything by email because it's the most effective way. You create an audit trail as well, which you can maybe use at a later date to highlight any inefficiencies there.
Well, that's a fantastic tip, Bill. Thank you for that. You kind of preempted my next question, really, because I was going to ask you, if you have a first-time UC or LHA claimant who is already in rent arrears, is it possible to go straight to direct payment for landlord under the protocols that you've just mentioned, or is that quite a challenge? If bearing in mind this tenant could already be in rent arrears, can you go straight for the APA?
Absolutely. First of all, there was in 2018, the DWP relaxed the rules so that anybody was moving from housing benefit over onto universal credit, where the money was already been paid to the landlord, then when that person was transferring over to universal credit, it allowed DWP to actually pay the money directly to the landlord. Most people, when they apply because the rent is 2 months in rent arrears. And the DWP staff seem to be well aware of that rule. But there's actually another 3 rules that are all on the same level of importance, one of which is 1 month's arrears that has been accrued over more than 2 months. So I usually just say over 3 months, 4 months, or whatever. That's justification for it. If the new tenant has been evicted in the last 12 months, then that is also justification for paying the money directly to the landlord. And again, I'll create a link, if you like, where we'll actually highlight those criteria. So DWP staff seem to know about the 2 months rule, but they don't necessarily understand, or they don't appreciate there's actually 3 other rules that are equally of importance that a landlord can apply for. The other thing is it's a discretionary-based system, this. So the tenant themselves can ask right at the outset when they speak to their case manager. One of the questions that should be addressed with them is, can you manage your money? Are you concerned about managing your money and your housing costs? And if they explain to the case manager or to their work coach that is a concern, that I've been evicted before and I don't want the same thing to happen again, I'd much prefer if you would pay the money directly to my landlord, I've got maybe a problem with alcohol, or maybe a problem of some other substance abuse, or I just find it difficult to manage. That work coach or the case manager can trigger the payments direct to the landlord from day one. They tend not to do it because very few people know about these type of things. They think that you have to do this online thing. But again, if you know what you're doing, there are ways in which you can get the money paid to the landlord in the first instance. This situation has actually got better. If you go back a number of years to 2017, there used to be the need for explicit consent before the DWP would allow the payment to go to the landlord. Now, through the complaints we made with the help of the NRLA to the, first of all, DWP and then the independent case examiner, they withdrew explicit consent in December 2017. However, some of the staff clearly didn't get the memo because some of them still actually refer to this in the refusals. There's also a scam just now where some tenants, when they hear the landlord has applied to get the money paid directly to them rather than to the tenant, they're not happy. And what they'll do sometimes is they'll phone up the DWP or they'll contact their case manager through the online journal and say, oh, listen, I've actually changed my landlord. And some have actually went to the bother of downloading an AST and actually falsely creating a tenancy. And initially, DWP staff were receiving these tenancies and just simply accepting them as being legitimate. When what they should have done was, first of all, was to suspend payment of the housing costs, because this tenant is now saying, I've left my landlord and I've moved to another one. So what they should have done was stop the housing cost under the old landlord thing, suspend it, not cancel it, and ask for validation. And the way they can do that is write to that new landlord. By me writing to their Director General, highlighting this, to be fair to DWP, they have now started to investigate some of these things. Now, they won't tell you the outcome of that investigation, but if you receive a cheque or a payment in your bank account, you'll know that it worked by highlighting it. And again, this is where the case manager and the practice managers play a big role in this. If you know who they are, write them their email address and all that, and highlight them. I usually put in the subject matter, urgent, public money being misused, and that usually perks up their interest in the case when that happens.
Indeed. Well, when we spoke back in May, Bill, one of the things that we did say, which will have proven to be correct, is that many landlords who'd never had to engage with the DWP or indeed the UC and LHA system would find themselves having to do so as a result of all the economic downturn following the COVID-19 lockdown. So I'm sure that you've been hearing from landlords that are first-timers in engaging with all these different processes, and it's almost another language you've got to learn with some of the jargon that's used around LHA and UC. Some people are still calling it DSS, of course, which I find extraordinary because the Department of Health and Social Security disappeared in the 1970s. But it's important to understand the language around this topic. How are you finding that landlords are coping? I think you've seen a delay in kind of complaints and appeals and that kind of scenario.
Yeah, I think most landlords who are experienced, particularly those who are experiencing housing benefit or LHA, they have, I think, very quickly in the main picked up on this, and they know that if you're hands-on and they know that if you navigate your way through the system, then you'll be able to resolve a lot of these problems. The biggest problem has been for those new claimants, first of all, that don't know about the system, never been unemployed before. Some have been working in jobs where they were getting £50,000 plus of a salary, never had to claim housing benefit before. So this is all very, very new to them. But as well as that, the landlords and the letting agents, many of them have never had somebody on benefits before. And we've discussed this many times in the past. that even if you think to yourself, that you don't want a benefit tenant, you can't exclude them, particularly recently because of these two cases that actually went to the tribunals, where the judges found that to reject somebody on the basis that they were on benefits was a breach of the European law. And my experience of dealing with this over many years is that many of the landlords I deal with have actually, those who have actually been taking benefit tenants have actually got some very good tenants. Some will tell me that they've had them for 10 years plus, and they're good tenants, so they reduce the voids and things like that. Many of the landlords and letting agents who come to me are concerned. They've got this perception, a negative perception of them. And when you explain to them, look, if you do all the right things, there's a good way of actually safeguarding yourself, and particularly in this environment just now. I mean, having somebody who's on universal credit and getting the money paid directly to you is as good a way as any of making sure that you get your money, because there's a lot of landlords just now who've actually got tenants who are on universal credit, and the tenants are getting the money and misusing that money. Now, I've been saying to the DWP and RLA as well, this is an area where we really need to say more about this, because there is a group of tenants out there, the minority, say 10% or whatever, who are getting the money and misusing it on a regular basis. And there's things that they are now picking up they can do to ensure that they get the money rather than the tenant. So we need to tighten up in a lot of these things. But if you know what you're doing and you know the people to contact, you can minimise that impact. You can't avoid it, because there'll be some times when it'll occur despite that level of knowledge. But the letting agents are coming to me just now. I'm spending maybe an hour or a couple of hours on these Zoom sessions, and I'm taking them through the very basics of it so that they know the various things that they should do and the things to look out for. You were talking about tips. There's certain dates, there's certain payments when you make the claim. If you make the claim today on the 19th of October, you should know that the claim runs from the 19th of October to the 18th of November, and that the payment will come 7 days later. And if you know that, you will know when to then anticipate the payment being made to you. And if it's not made by that date, there's a problem. You really need to start investigating, if not before that date that it's due. I used to run a credit management company, and we used to do this all over Europe. And we had people who would actually phone people before the date of their payment was due. And it was remarkable how successful that was, just by reminding them, by the way, your payment's due on whatever date it was. So without having to resort to recovery action, repossession and all that, we were able to increase the collection rates by doing that. And the same equally applies with this. And if you can get payments made directly to you, then, as I say, that's an insurance for you, that you're going to have at least the payments coming in every month so that you can meet your own obligations to your own lenders. And I think that's something that's sometimes overlooked by the DWP and the independent case examiner as well. Now, some landlords have only got one property or two or three properties, and they're relying on this money to pay their landlords. Some of the cases.
That's an incoming call from a landlord that needs help, Bill.
Yeah. Sorry about this.
Okay.
I've actually been speaking to these landlords and these letting agents and going through the basics of when they can expect payment and how they can access the payments direct themselves by making the online request, and then supporting that by a week later or a couple of weeks later sending a reminder to the DWP saying, look, we made our application on whatever date it is, we haven't heard anything. Because one of the flaws of this new system, which in many ways is much better than the one before it, but it doesn't really acknowledge your application. It doesn't acknowledge and give you a reference number you can then use at a later date and ask, what's happening with this claim. So again, by using the practice managers and the case managers, you can chase these things up. And if you don't get any response to that, you can then escalate things to Neil Cowling's office if need be, to try and get a result. Because some of these cases can quite quickly, particularly in areas like London where the rents are so high, can quite quickly run up £2,000 or £3,000 worth of rent arrears. So by following these processes that we've put in place, we're able to mitigate some of the potential losses that landlords have been experiencing.
Well, these are all fantastic tips and insights as ever, Bill. But as we wrap this up, I think, we are going into an economic decline. There is going to be a lot more unemployment. And at the end of the day, to end on a positive note, LHA and UC housing benefit element is actually a form of guaranteed rent from the government. So every landlord has a fallback position if the tenant becomes unemployed.
Well, yeah, I mean, they should. In most cases, it works. It works really well. As I mentioned earlier on, it's when it goes wrong that's where the problem is. But even there, if you pick up on the problem quickly and you know who to contact, and forget about phoning, actually take the time to email the practice managers, the district managers, the area directors. If you get to know who these people are, and when I do the Zoom sessions as well, what I say to these landlords and letting agents is, here's the area manager for your area, or the district manager for your area. Write to them and actually explain who you are, explain that you're having tenants who are claiming universal credit, and you want to work with them positively to try and cut out some of the problems that might arise. And I was dealing with one just last week, and it's a big development down in the south of England, and there's about 200 properties involved, and about a third of them have been allocated to people on benefits. And I wrote to the DWP and I said to them, look, here, one of my clients is doing this. Would you be willing to help out? Do you know that the district managers agreed for their staff to actually sit in the initial intake period and actually help them process the claims and also process the direct payments to the landlords where it's appropriate as well? Because many of the people that have been accommodated are coming from a homeless background or a roofless background, or may have been a refugee before, or they've been addicted for some reason in the past, or they maybe have a drug addiction problem. Any of those scenarios, I've found that if you write to the individuals concerned, then you're likely to get a good positive. I had another landlord down in London who was losing money, quite a wee bit of money every month because of the problems he was encountering. He did that, and he actually wrote to me basically saying, you've actually transformed my business, just by alerting me to who I could write to. And he was invited into their office to actually see different things that they could be done, to try and help. And he's since passed it on to other landlords that he's friendly with. So by sharing information as well with your colleagues, etc., you'll actually help to mitigate some of the potential losses.
Oh, well said, Bill. And you are a wonderful resource, not only to the Property Tribes community, but the wider landlord community as well. You do a lot of work with the NRLA. You are there to support landlords that have very difficult and complex cases on a consultancy basis. So just want to thank you for sharing so much good knowledge and intel and giving us this update since we last spoke in May, and lots more to talk on this topic, and we should book another call in a couple of months' time and see how things are running. But for now, Bill, just want to say thank you very much for being part of the Property Tribes community and information streams, and we really do appreciate the service you offer and for taking part in this call as well. It's been very enlightening as always, so thank you very much to Bill.
And thank you, Vanessa.